welcome to What's Left, a weekly political discussion challenging the mainstream left. I'm Andy Lipson with co-host, community organizer and socialist Kenny Zepeda, and guest co-host Jessica, college-level lecturer and organizer in Washington State. We are online at what-s-left.webnode.com. Please subscribe, rate, review, turn on your notifications, and share your favorite episode wherever you found this episode. Thank you. Well, first off, you'll notice Eduardo is not here today. So if anybody wants to hear Eduardo, unfortunately, he's not going to be here today, largely because I scheduled this meetup at the wrong time. But Jessica will be standing in for him. And you will also notice that a previous guest or a person who's been here a lot is here today, John Klyczek, and he's joining us. And John Kleisick is the author of School Word Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education, and he is a contributor to Unlimited Hangout. He is also the director of writing and editing at Black Freighter Productions Books, and he holds a black belt in classical Taekwondo, and he is a certified kickboxing instructor under the International Muay Thai Boxing Association. So welcome, John.
Hey, glad to be back as always.
Excellent. And today you're going to be talking to us about your article that you just came out with, maybe about 2 weeks ago, about unions, entitled "The American Federation of Teachers Sells Out to Rockefellers, Trilateralists and Big Tech." And one of the reasons I was hoping to have Jessica here for that is you're going to talk to us about unions. And Jessica, you've had a lot of experience in organizing in your union in the past. Is that correct?
I wouldn't say a lot, but yes, I have been an active member of my union at my university. Yeah. And
I thought that the stuff in your article was really interesting, Jake. Hoping you can share it with us here, and we'll see what kind of questions come up from myself or Kenny or Jessica.
Awesome. Yep.
So why don't you just say a little bit about why you even got into writing this article? I think start there, and then maybe a little bit about what you found in it.
Okay. Yeah. So how did I come to write this article? There's a couple different ways. It's kind of in some ways started way before I actually put any pen to paper or started digging deeply into the research. And that is, this is almost a year ago, actually. Back in October of that last year. Wow, it doesn't seem like a whole year, but it's a whole year. And I spent 30 days with my friend and my mentor, Charlotte Thompson Iserby. She's the one who wrote the foreword to my book. She also wrote the Delivery Going Down in America. She worked for the Department of Education under Ronald Reagan. She blew the whistle on something called Project Best, and that was what got her fired and basically got her into to write the book. She also worked for the State Department. She was Middle Eastern Affairs. She was also Soviet Affairs. This was before she went to the Department of Education. And I was there, and she gave me access to all her files. And she had a barn with 36 cabinets full of documents that she kept, not just from the Department of Education, but other documents for travels and other stuff that people sent her. So she let me go through that, and I found a couple files on largely on the NEA. And this article that I wrote for Unlimited Hangout was going to actually be about 12,000 words. And Whitney Webb said, even for our readers, that's probably too long. So she was like, cut it up, which was fine. So half of it was AFT, half of it was NEA. And then there was some stuff on the passports. And so it's going to be 3 pieces, and I'm working on the stuff on NEA. But what got me to actually start to put that research that I found in Charlotte's into the article was I saw that our unions in a lot of ways they're pretty much in lockstep with the World Economic Forum and the larger ed tech agenda and the ed tech industry. And some of that had to do with the files I found where there was connections going back to Project Best. And so one of the things that really made me jump into this article and actually try to get it out was when the CDC was lobbied by the AFT, so I think the organization is Americans for Public Trust. They got Freedom of Information Act requests to get the email exchanges between the AFT and the CDC. The NEA is in there. The big story in the media, mainstream media, was about the AFT because the language that was provided by the AFT was adopted by the CDC, and so the CDC at the time, this was back in March, the emails were from February, but the CDC had basically said we could go back to in-person learning at any rate of community transmission, and it said that we could reduce the 6-foot social distancing to 3-foot social distancing, which, to me is silly because either the virus travels 6 feet or it doesn't, right? So I mean, if you're gonna get rid of 3 to 3 feet, you might as well just get rid of it entirely, right? So, but when I saw that, we've been told all the time, if you or I were to go on social media or any public forum and suggest that the CDC should alter their recommendations based on peer-reviewed science or other data, that they would say that we need to trust the science and follow the science. But for some reason, it was totally cool for the AFT and the NEA to tell the CDC what to do, and so it wasn't in line with the mantra we've heard during this whole lockdown thing. So to me, anytime you see something like that, there's probably an ulterior motive. And me knowing what I knew about their connection to the ed tech industry, I saw this as a way to basically wedge in the perpetuation of the distance learning and or the hybrid or blended learning. So distance learning is when you're totally online and remote. Hybrid or blending is when you mix the two together. Either you're in the room but you're on a pod, a computer the whole time, the teacher's a facilitator, or hybrid is where you would have to alternate. So if you have 3-foot distance, that's probably enough space in between desks where you can fill the whole classroom. If you go 6-foot distance, you're only going to be able to put about half the students in the desks at a time, which means you're going to have to use the hybrid learning, which means you're going to have to continue the whole ed tech privatization thing. And so basically just left the doors open for these companies to continue privatizing the public schools. And so that's the gist of how I got into it. And so the rest of the article basically documents, this one focusing specifically on the AFT, documents the history of their connections to the ed tech industry and then their current lockstep with the larger ed tech agenda.
Yeah, I'm curious about, some of the players. I wasn't familiar with the AFT, the American Federation of Teachers, as to how big is it, who are they, who did they represent, in theory at least. Maybe if you can speak to that.
Yeah, so the American Federation of Teachers is the second largest teachers union in the United States. And NEA, National Education Association, is the largest. Technically, the NEA is founded as a professional union, right, or a union of professionals, and the AFT classifies itself as a trade union. And so you can actually, and I noticed this looking through the files that Charlotte had, but then also in the other research, and that is that the AFT has always been more favorable to the public-private partnerships, workforce training, and basically the corporate agenda. The NEA tends to, at least rhetorically, not be quite as gung-ho about that. And so one of the examples of how the AFT has historically been in line with the workforce training and the public-private corporate partnerships has to do with President Albert Shanker. He was the president for a very long time, several decades. And he's actually the guy that conceptualized charter schools. Right now, they didn't really call them charter schools at the time. But his idea was to have basically these pilot schools, these public-private partnerships, where he pitched it as there would be more freedom for teachers to do their own thing, but it was actually it becomes the charter school agenda, and actually on the AFT's website, the article's maybe a couple of years old at the most. It's called Restoring Shanker's Vision for Charter Schools. And they basically say something to the effect of, well, it's not about whether they're good or bad anymore. It's just about how can we make them better And just one more interesting connection to the AFT and charter schools, that is the current president of the AFT, Randy Weingarten. She used to run a charter school when she was the president of the UFT, United Federation of Teachers. They have their UFT charter school, and it was supposedly it was designed to show that you could run a charter school and have a union at the charter school, but it still would be effectively a public-private partnership. So that's what the AFT is. It's it is right. It's a teachers union, but technically it does classify itself more as a trade union, which means right it identifies more with right the larger workforce economy more than just the professional agenda of teachers.
And the other element of it that makes it a little bit, so I'm in a union called United Educators of San Francisco, and that has like 6,000 members. Something like and that's for teachers representing like 6,000 teachers in the San Francisco Unified School District, right? The AFT and the NEA are not like one union essentially. They're like a national union. They're a union of unions. So and we have, if I'm in a union right now, and we have state affiliates, California Federation of Teachers and the California Teachers Association, which is a union of unions in the state of California for teachers. Well, now think about that whole thing over the country, unions of unions up to and then now you're talking about things like AFT and NEA. And so that's another thing to know is like, and what we're really talking about is a bureaucracy. Now there is an election and things like that, and we elect delegates who go to a national meeting, but it's pretty separate from us. So that's something I would say. And I don't know, Jessica, if you want to add anything to our conception of this thing of AFT, NEA, and what it is.
Yeah, I think you said it pretty well. Like it feels very removed when you're just sort of a lowly member of your local chapter. It does feel, even, pre-COVID, very much feels, like a bureaucracy that's very distant. And obviously just the reach of that umbrella organization has a lot of leverage over policy and decision making.
And well, one thing to know though is like, so I think if this numbers are right, UESF, 6,000 teachers and paraprofessionals, we pay about $6 million of dues, collect about $6 million of dues, around that number per year from its members that go to UESF. More than half of that money goes to either the CTA, the CFT, the NEA, or the AFT. So more than 3 million per year goes to the affiliates, goes up there. And now the idea is, oh, look, these are unions and unions. We could all come together and we could strike statewide. We could strike nationwide. That's not what they're doing. Most of what I do know, and this is the stuff that Jake's found, I didn't know. My reason I've been suspicious because it's always just money that seems to go to the Democratic Party, and that connection. But I think Jake is exposing kind of deeper connections into what I would describe are elements of the capitalist class that are really tight. Not just like, oh, these are supposed to be our enemies as workers, and they're just, I guess I'm getting into your material now, Jake, so I shouldn't.
No, that's I. So a couple things. So one is you're right. So it's a federation, meaning that right there is a national chapter, a national branch, but there are state level too, and then there's local, right? And so technically, so the NEA, I know I'm kind of mixing NEA and AFT here, but they have largely the same structure as far as the federation. So I'll just use them as a current example. There was recently a vote at the national NEA conference to vote. This is before these governors started giving the mandates at the schools, and the NEA was going to get in front of it, and they wanted to vote to say that we all had to have the vaccine passport, or the vaccine. Okay, not necessarily the passport, but that's where it goes, right? And the state level delegates voted it down. So there is a separation of powers that can sometimes play in the favor of the local branches and teachers on the ground, but more often than not, it's not going to be like if you got one local branch and y'all want to go on strike, if the state doesn't want to do it and the national doesn't want to do it, you're pretty much not going to get any support. And most people when they go on strike, they're like, well, we need funding to go on strike. And so you're not gonna get it. So I mean, so that, like you say, that it's at least a separation of powers, and it is sort of broken up like that. But at the end of the day, it really is the state level and the or rather the national level and the state level that sort of set the agenda. Another way to say that is if the NEA had passed that at the national, then by default, everybody that basically signs onto the national through the state and local basically has to go along with that, right? And actually, in my state, they recently did the mandate for the vaccine. The IEA already said, yeah, we support it. So, I don't know how much breathing room that gives the local union to say no, right? But the other thing that you mentioned is that the partnerships at the national level, they like you said, a lot of times those PACs do go basically straight to the Democratic Party. This is one of the differences, though, that I found in the NEA and the AFT. Right, the AFT more explicitly has a lot more partnerships with like IBM. There's a lot of connections to the Rockefeller Foundation, and then also the Trilateral Commission, which was set up by David Rockefeller. So maybe I should define the Trilateral Commission briefly before I give you a little story about Albert Shanker and the Trilateral Commission. Now that's an example of at the top of the AFT, their real constituents are corporate globalists. It's not union dues paying teachers, right? And so the Trilateral Commission is basically a non-governmental organization. It comes out of the Milner Roundtables that were set up at the early turn of the century. An example of a Milner Roundtable would be the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, and also the Royal Institute for International Affairs in Europe or in the UK. And so, our Council on Foreign Relations is basically our American version of the Royal Institute of International Affairs. And basically what they are they're NGOs, non-governmental organizations. So you get these there's like think tanks called roundtables, and you get people from representatives from different industries, media, heads of state, things like that. They get together and essentially plan, the world economy, or where do they want to move forward with markets and things like that. The Trilateral Commission was formed in the 70s, and it was set up by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And it was created to like a roundtable that would combine the Anglo-American establishment, so that's the United States and Europe, the Western capitalist countries, with some of the nations of East Asia, so Japan in particular, but others as well. Okay, and it's basically, again, it's to figure out how do they want to manage global markets based on various public-private partnerships, international partnerships. Okay. And I found out that Albert Shanker was a member of the Trilateral Commission. And funny story, how I even found it was I was asking my friend, her name's Ann Herzer, and she was one of Charlotte's friends who was one of these great researchers. She actually was high up at the Arizona Federation of Teachers. And at one of these meetings at the AFT, she told me, because I was asking her some questions to help me kind of zero in on what I was looking for. And she said that she went to a meeting and talked to Albert Shanker. And Albert Shanker, she asked him, why is it that the AFT only supports Democratic candidates, like you were saying? And she said he got really nervous, and all of a sudden, he starts shaking her hand and wouldn't let go of her hand. She said she basically had to yank it out. But as he's shaking her hand, I guess he's thinking because she's more conservative minded, although she really, it's not right wing like that. I mean, she's active in the union, right? And so it's left and up, right? And so he's thinking, I guess, that he's trying to score bonus points. And he goes, well, I am a member of the Trilateral Commission, not knowing that that would be one of the worst things he could tell her, right? And I asked her, I said, how can I document that? And she's like, well, I don't know, but I'm telling you that's what happened. You can quote me if you want to. So I said, well, I might do that, but let me see if I can find it. And there's a speech, it's in the article, where he admits he's at a meeting with the Trilateral Commission, and he says there was, quote, bankers and the head of IBM, right? And so that's just one of these examples of, they're supposed to be representing teachers, but you're going to these meetings, and in the means, you're going to these meetings with these, corporate globalists, big companies, big banks, and basically, you're all at the same time, you're setting up public-private partnerships, right? And I did another article for Unlimited Hangout. It's UNESCO Study 11 and UNESCO 2050, and I basically document how Project BEST was our domestic version of this UNESCO project, which was trying to set up public-private partnerships globally through the ed tech industry to set up the IT that we need for this fourth industrial revolution. So, right, it wasn't just like him selling out the American teachers, but it was also partnering with this whole global World Economic Forum, what's become the Great Reset.
I mean, you already talked about how they lobbied the CDC, right, to keep the door open for again, more privatization, more ed tech, and at least from what I hear, I've heard the argument that at least from a lot of leftist groups, that capitalism wants to basically sacrifice kids, right? So that's what going back to school means. Putting kids in the danger of in peril of dying, because that's what capitalism wants, right? And obviously, from this group, probably we have a different view on that. But what would you say to that? What is the danger? I mean, do you agree with that statement? That kids are going back to be put in peril by being put back in the classroom.
Yeah, and that is the angle that the union makes of saying that they're trying to get us back into the classroom. They want to kill us.
Yeah, and sacrifice us in the name of capitalism.
Yeah,
that's the argument I've heard.
Well, I would rebut by posing the question: what do you think would be more profitable to the capitalist class, especially as we roll out this fourth industrial revolution, this digital economy? What do you think would be more profitable to them? To kill off basically all their little worker bees, or to basically acclimate them to the new teleworking infrastructure? That I would pose a question with a question. I would also say, what makes you think that they're not in danger, getting these experimental shots and then having masks on their faces all day and the psychological damage from that? I would add that to my question.
Well, and just with regard to ed tech, even more broadly, like your article kind of traces, the ways that, like the Rockefellers, for example, right, kind of use these, like the psychological conditioning in that, right, like as a way sort of which is really, talk about like nefarious control of children and young people. So I don't know, maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, Jake. Like I was really interested in when you were going back through like the AFT Rockefeller connections, like I have your article here, like the stimulus response methods and the programmed instruction. Like, can you talk about, more explicitly, just so people can get an idea of like materially, like what kinds of things are we talking about?
Okay, yeah. So two levels, right? At the level of like capitalist production and profit, they can monetize all that psychometric data, right? But then they also use it to train the students for what they call workforce competence, right? So it has a twofold effect, right? One is they can actually make money just off the data itself by coming up with different social credit algorithms and predictive analytics. But then they're going to actually use those algorithms to train the students to basically be reflexive little worker bees. So the stimulus response method is basically root of all of your behavioral psychology. It was Wilhelm Wundt that came up with the idea out of Leipzig, Germany, back in the 19th century. And then you have different theorists, different psychologists who sort of refine it. You go from the stimulus response or classical conditioning, then it becomes behaviorism with people like John B. Watson, E.L. Thorndike, and he did his puzzle box experiments with animals. And then based on that, B.F. Skinner came up with operant conditioning, which is pretty much one of the more modern versions of this stimulus response. So basically, instead of just having one-way stimulus response, the behaviorists, they basically they came up with algorithms that were used reward punishment cycles, and then the operant conditioning theories, they basically add two more quadrants to it. So it's like positive and negative punishment, positive and negative reward, right? And then and so where the Rockefeller Foundation comes in is they basically funded it through the General Education Board, through the Rockefeller Foundation and other Rockefeller philanthropies. There's so many Rockefeller philanthropies, it's not funny. There's Rockefeller Family Associates, there's Rockefeller Family Advisors, there's the JDR the Third Fund, there's Rockefeller Foundation, there's Rockefeller Impact Investment Fund. So all of these at some point have been involved, and we could start with one of the founding members of the American Federation of Teachers, who was John Dewey, right? And so if you're in education, right, you're not going to get through school, especially if you're trained to be a teacher, without hearing about, the praises of John Dewey. And so what John Dewey did was he basically took that stimulus response method, and he added more like holistic psychology from somebody like William James. Okay, and so he thought that just the whole that the mechanistic system of like environment and the person receiving the stimuli, like it was just this direct mechanism. He thought that it had to have more of like it had to be immersed in the culture more. So what he basically did was he came up with this thing called functionalist psychology, but it still integrates the stimulus response method. And so when he goes to the University of Chicago, I should mention that John Dewey, he studied under G. Stanley Hall. And G. Stanley Hall was basically the first American to get a PhD from Wilhelm Wundt. So he went over there in Leipzig. G. Stanley Hall came and brought it back. And then there's hundreds of PhDs that would basically start all of the seminal psychology classes, right? Before that, psychology was basically a subdiscipline of philosophy. But after G. Stanley Hall, you started to have departments of psychology, and they were all immediately integrated with educational psychology. So Dewey basically, he inherits that system from G. Stanley Hall, and he tweaks it a little bit with some William James stuff to create functionalist psychology. And when he goes to the University of Chicago, he was funded by Rockefellers, right? The University of Chicago itself is heavily funded by the Rockefellers. I can't remember which particular philanthropy it was, but it's in the article. And I should mention here that John Dewey also, he taught John B. Watson. So John B. Watson, who comes up with behaviorism later, he studied under Dewey. And John B. Watson is actually the guy, he was also an advertiser. So this stuff, it goes into education, but it also goes into the corporate world. And, I should mention that the adaptive learning algorithms, that's the modern teaching machine, they are based on the behavioral advertising algorithms used by Netflix and Amazon. And they explicitly use that example. They say it's basically the same algorithms that we use to market to people, okay? And then later, John Dewey would go to the University of Columbia, and he was again funded by Rockefeller money, this time through the General Education Board. This was actually one of the first philanthropies that the Rockefellers came up with. And through the General Education Board, they funded all sorts of behaviorist psychology, and specifically designed for workforce training. And there's a quote from I think it's Frederick T. Gates. It's Gates is the last name. It was the guy who basically managed the philanthropy for Rockefeller. And in one of the seminal papers for the General Education Board, I'm going to paraphrase this, but the precise quote is in my book. He said something to the effect of, we don't want to make lawyers or artists or philosophers. We want everybody to keep doing what they're doing in their everyday workforce roles, but we want to perfect it. What that basically meant was this was the emergence of the industrial economy from an agrarian economy. They just wanted to basically retrain, the workforce base to be able to work in factories and stuff like that. And now what we got going on, right, as we mentioned earlier, we got this new digital economy, this teleworking economy, this token-based economy. So we want to train these kids to do that, to do the same thing for this next evolution of capitalism. Okay, and so the teaching machine that B.F. Skinner came up with, it was actually Sidney L. Pressey, who was the founding father of teaching machines, but it was B.F. Skinner who basically popularized it. And basically what he did was he took the whole stimulus response mechanism and he turned the stimulus into like learning stimuli, such as like multiple choice, matching, short answer, whatever it is, right? The assignment, and then the response, right, is however the student responds to it, right? So which letter do they pick, and based on how quickly and how efficiently they respond to the learning stimuli, that would then either accelerate the student to like honors classes, or it would remediate them to like have to retake it until they could move on to the next lesson. When B.F. Skinner did it, they were analog, so they were on like gears and wheels and a reel of tape and stuff. You just take that, you digitize it, and you remove the gears and the tape and the wheels, and you just create windows on a screen and clicks on a mouse. You can make it a little more interactive with videos and maybe some video games and things like that. But again, this is now called adaptive learning software from Dreambox, which is one of the more popular adaptive learning software companies. But it basically uses those behaviorist, the personalized advertising algorithms, the stimulus response method, to track the students into what they call career pathways. And then those career pathways are going to be financed by these pay for success grants that are basically what's known as impact financing or impact. So this is a little graphic from Dreambox here. Okay, and then you've got here's the student here, and it's numbered in terms of like how the data gets cycled. So you take the student, you expose them to the content, that's the learning stimuli. Okay, and then what comes out the other end is going to be the student learning data. Okay, and then that feeds into this, goes all the way across through this predictive model, and it's going to create a student information system. So that's like the student's psychological profile. So like on the right side, this is like whatever the student is, the learning data that he or she is responding to for that module. And then based on what he or she does, it's going to build this thing over here on the left, and it's going to be like their permanent record, right? And so the thing on the right is always going to be tied to the thing on the left. So, if you do really good on the one on the right one time, but the last 10 times you did really bad, right, over here on the left, it's not going to say, hey, you're really smart. It's going to be like, well, you did good on that one, but you've been doing not so good, so you're going to have to try this again. And then based on this adaptive engine, the predictive model is going to spit the student out either into the next lesson, but you'll see it goes back up into the content. So again, right, based on what the student does here on the right side and based on the aggregate over time, it's going to feed new content that's either going to be more difficult or maybe remediated based on the student's algorithms.
Yeah, and in one of the questions, there was one thing in the article that you had basically said that the AFT has a history of being dedicated to that kind of adaptive learning model, even before you would see it computerized. And in the article, there were teachers who were trying to push for a different way of teaching. So one thing that was a question for me, because maybe it's kind of limited, but because I think of grades and I think of yes, that's the right answer. No, that's the wrong answer. What are other models that could have been put in play that educators have wanted? Do you know about those things? because I feel like I've only been, because I think of grades, and grades to me feel like part of that thing. That seems like that's like a Skinner thing, isn't it?
Yeah, in some ways it is, right? So like, even like the whole gold star and the detention system, all that, they're punishments and rewards. And I think it's Alfie Kohn, actually. I think the book is Punished by Rewards. He even talks about the ineffectiveness of like the gold star system. I remember as a kid feeling belittled anytime I got a sticker or a star. And I'm not saying other people didn't, but to me, it was like, I know how good I did or whether I didn't. Like, don't put this little thing on here to like pat me on my head, right? So, grades at a certain level, I mean, right? It can have that effect, right? Especially in some classes they would post your grades, right, and like rank you so like where you fit in the whole pecking order and stuff like that. Definitely has a social engineering quality to it. At the same time, I mean, at some level, you do have to assess, is the student understanding the concepts, right? And I think that the alternative models would always. I think that any model would have to have some form of assessment. Now, does it have to be like ABCD grade, or could it be like a portfolio of the stuff you did over a semester, or oral exam? Or, I don't. There's different ways, but. I think that some of the alternative models that a lot of teachers were trying to push or offer would be, basically classical methods. And classical methods are looking at conceptual understanding, not performance-based understanding, right? And so, as far as the adaptive engine on that that Dreambox, for example, I remember getting bored doing standardized tests. And start spelling words like cab, dad, bad, abacadabra, right? And like, if you use that to like, and like, oh, this kid, he doesn't understand anything. We're gonna have to track him into the, remedial classes. But if they see, and by the way, they did. They knew that when I was not doing my best, right? And but they know conceptually, like this kid actually understands what we're saying. He just doesn't want to do the work, and or at least doesn't enjoy the work in the way that the format that it's presented. So the other thing about that is I guess I don't think it's the assessment or grading in itself. It's this idea of keeping this log of everything that you do all the time, and then trying to create this permanent psychological profile where that's going to follow the student, not just in that class, but that module, wherever they go to a different school. If that other school uses Dreambox, it's going to take their dashboard with them. And, like I had classes where, I was not the best student, let's just say. I was a troublemaker and things like that. And a lot of that had to do with the teacher, though. Like, if I knew I could get away with stuff, I would just keep pushing the line, right? But I had teachers that on day one, they nipped it in the bud, and I knew I can't get away with anything in this class, and I would perform great. And they would say things, these other teachers would complain about me, and they'd be like, I don't have a problem with it. Like, I don't know what you're doing, but he's fine in my class. So, in this model, you can't get out of that, right? Even if you go to another class where the teacher hey, man, this kid's a lot brighter than what everybody says, or he behaves fine when we do it this way. You're going to have, because all this instruction is going to be mediated through the platform, and it's going to have to basically be based on the students' their dashboard and their analytics. So even if you see something intuitively, like you won't even have the ability to basically subvert that, that permanent psychological record. And ultimately it's more about how does the student perform than like what does the student know, right? And so you can demonstrate what you know in other ways besides what they call performance-based assessments.
To me, it makes me think of obviously like a rhetorical question: what is the purpose of learning and education? Obviously, in capitalism, you want to perform in the market, and for social mobility, access to things. But like, in a non-capitalist society, that's what I think about. But like looking at this, what you just mentioned, makes me think of what Alison McDowell has brought up, like we're putting an emphasis on STEM, right? And forget science, John, you mentioned, right? Like lawyers and this, that. So we are creating a very narrow path for learning and productivity and acceptable rewarded productivity, because that's what I think of education. You know, in our conversations here, that we are sorted through at the school level in order to be either like at the top of the food chain or at the bottom. And you know, a lot of the people that are at the top are born into those, you know, situations. They don't even, you know, they go to the elite schools. But here we have a situation where, right, we have algorithms and people that are writing coded opinions, telling you, you know, what you're good at, and, you know, limiting you to that. And that's the danger I see here, right? Like, of, you know, if you don't perform to that, especially in a situation where compliance, I guess that's what I'm trying to say here, that, you know, ultimately that's what I see as a grave danger. You know, that if you don't perform to what is being asked through these systems, and if you question these systems, you know, you will be, you know, basically killed from participating in these systems. And, you know, that's part of what I think is the danger with vaccine passports, right? That if you're non-compliant, then you're excluded. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I guess that what I'm seeing is a narrowing of the path for the human experience, and also the ability to participate outside these acceptable mechanisms of learning.
Yeah, and it ties into something called competency-based education, CBE, and the term is used, I want to say, over 100 sometimes. This precise citation is in an article I wrote on COVID and distance learning. You can get it on my website. When they during the beginning of the whole COVID lockdown, they came up with 85 FR 18638, and that was this bill to deregulate the use of, quote, it says adaptive learning, and refers to it as artificial intelligence, and it wants to use the competency-based model. And the competency-based model it's not about you know, conceptual understanding or holistic understanding or the ability to make up your own mind about that understanding. Competency has to do with you're competent enough. You're just competent enough. You're competent enough to perform the task, right? You're not competent enough to ask questions about the task, to maybe, you know, try it a different way that probably could be better, and certainly probably is at least better for you. And this model is actually, it's getting a lot more steam now, but all this stuff, and I learned this by going through all of Charlotte's files, all this stuff is at least 40 to 60 years old. Right? All these buzzwords, they're getting more and more play, and they're getting shoved down our throats more and more. But one of the earlier models of the competency-based education came out of what they wanted to do. They really started a lot of the Skinner method actually on reading. Now, if we even go prior to when they started using the Skinner method on reading through something called ECRI, Exemplary Center for Instruction in Reading, something like that, or Reading Instruction, sorry, Exemplary Center for Reading Instruction, was one of these places that Dan Herzer, the one who told me about Shanker, had basically discovered they were using the Skinner method, okay? And before that, though, you know, the whole idea of, you know, when they used to talk about teaching literacy, they always wanted you to be able to read enough, be literate enough where you can read an instruction manual and basically do what it says, but not enough to be able to understand fallacies for propaganda or to ask questions and to be able to say, like, wait, I mean, I know what I see that I got, you know, instructions 1 through 5, and I see what they mean on the surface level. But when I put them all together, right, it seems like you're asking me to do something unethical, right? And so this is sort of the same idea here, except, right, it's just remove it from the realm of literacy and then just put it into this realm of STEM skills, right? They want you to be able to maybe do some very minimal coding at the best, be able to interact with the windows and the modules, but not enough to understand like how it's data mining you, or maybe to be able to write your own code, or, you know, something like
that. And just to that, one of my friends just finished a program at Berkeley, $12,000 for coding, and, you know, and I talk about some of the stuff, you know, that we talk about here, blockchain and, you know, data mining and completely, unaware, right? They just finished a program of coding that cost a lot of money, and then now they're moving into a career path, right? In that realm, and obviously is motivated by wanting to have some social mobility, right? Because and anticipating that's where it's going to be. But again, it goes unquestioned, right? And it also makes me think of my other, coworker who just graduated from he got a master's degree in engineering from SF State, and we were talking about the issues with society, production over production, and his answer was, from an engineer perspective, we just got to produce more, right? So this lack of critical thinking, and just that was his answer. He didn't have a conceptual understanding of how things connect, and to have critical thinking. So I guess we just got to produce more to solve the problems of society.
And I just wanted to add something real short, which is, you asked a question, a hypothetical question, and it's like, so what is the purpose of learning? And, like, I've been asked that question many times since I wrote the book, right? And I had to think about it hard, because even as I'm writing it, I'm thinking like, well, you do got to get a job when you get out of school. So, but that's actually not the purpose of education. The purpose of education is not teaching somebody what to think or what to do. It's teaching somebody how to think so that they can make up their own decisions about what to do. And teaching someone how to think has to do with some of the basics of the classical method, grammar, logic, rhetoric, being able to point out fallacies in the rhetoric of corporate propaganda, government propaganda, and then therefore being an autodidact. It's a fancy word for being you teach yourself. Right. Most of the stuff that I learned, all of the stuff that I'm talking about right now, I didn't get it from academia. Right. I mean, I had to find it on my own. I had to learn stuff on my own, like blockchain. I've written about blockchain, but before I could write about it, I had to figure out what is blockchain? What's a distributed ledger technology? What's the difference between a crypto and the smart contract? How do you prove the contract? Right. You have to understand the infrastructure before you can actually articulate it. But at the end of the day, you have a basic understanding of grammar, meaning the symbols we use to identify reality. You understand formal logic and the principle of non-contradiction. Pretty much anybody can give names or categories to the stuff that they identify in the real world. They can tell whether or not what they have organized in their mind either is cohesive and coherent or whether it's contradictory. If it's contradictory, you get rid of it. You go back to the drawing board. And you can pretty much work your way through anything as such. But, both of these things, grammar in particular, we don't teach. My degree is in English. They basically poo-poo on teaching any form of like formal grammar, sentence diagramming. That's, they call it whole language learning. It gets rid of alphabetic phonics and all that. And then there's no formal logic. So the idea, law of identity, law of contradiction, law of tautology, which are these basic principles you use to make sure that the stuff you're thinking makes sense. Like they don't teach that, right? And when they teach rhetoric, they don't really teach ethos, logos, pathos either, right? Like I've seen assignments, rhetorical analysis. It's got an audience, purpose, style, tone, and those things are rhetorical elements. But the basis of it has to do with logic, trust, and emotion, right? And so you give a student an essay assignment. And I've often, until I really delved into the classical method, you look at a paper and you go, how did the student start with thesis A, but they didn't even get 2 paragraphs down before they're saying the totally opposite thing that their thesis said? How do you not follow that? Well, that's what happens when you don't have a basic understanding of these simple concepts, right? It doesn't have to be, a career pathway at the end of it, because you can make your own career pathway if you can make sense of the world, so.
Yeah. So picking up on like the literacy aspect of it, I mean, that's my experience too. Like I know at my institution, we're actively discouraged from teaching grammar, which I find just so illogical in an English department. But one of the things that really kind of scares me is just the way in which, and I mean, I'm talking about university level, like K through 12, I can't even imagine, right? But, these young people, they're so heavily propagandized and they've grown up without really like knowing any life experience at all outside technocracy, right? That in a lot of cases, like I find that the students themselves are kind of calling for things like remote learning and the gamification stuff, ed tech devices, and now like lecture capture as we're like sort of returning for a little bit in person, which I just see as surveillance. So I was just wondering, the students themselves, like, I don't know, we always talk about agency and that, right? And in higher ed, like, do they have any? How do they see us, the students, I mean? And kind of like, I don't know, I always feel, it's like, here we are, like I'm 32, and then going up, right? Like these teachers were fighting for sort of the destruction of this system while some of the students are kind of like calling for it. And then like with the rhetorical piece, like talking about teaching rhetoric, and that's such a big part of this, right? Like in your article, you talk about, all the stupid buzzwords, like the pathways and the impact and innovation and resilience and all of the, just like makes you want to vomit, right? And I wonder, like going back to the parallel you drew between education and then advertising. And I see every year my incoming students seem to be less and less literate. And I mean, I guess it's like, well, that's my job. I got it right. I don't know. I need to teach your book, I guess. But yeah, what do you think in terms of like, I mean, you teach rhetoric, right? So I'm curious kind of how you think about the students themselves.
Yeah, so I teach it. I'm an adjunct. I'm at different community colleges, and it's probably not much better at the university level, even probably some of the more Big Ten schools and things like that. But I mean, certainly a lot of students, even students that test into 101, which is college level, although I teach what they call developmental, that's 98, 99, which means you're not there yet, you're still at high school level. And I used to teach GED too, adult ed down the way. In 16 weeks, you know what I mean? There's not a whole, you know what I mean? You can't really undo a lot of that, right? So I try to give them I emphasize ethos, logos, pathos. I basically emphasize the principle of non-contradiction all year long. I don't really get too, because logic can get, if you're not used to it, formal logic can be like, whoa, this sounds a lot of jargon and confusion, but like everybody knows, right, what a contradiction is, or at least I go over it at first. And I say, look, what the word tells you what it is. You got contra or counter, dick, like dictionary, to say. It's the opposite of what you just said, right? So I tell them, you can get through a paper without contradicting yourself, and you can use your appeals effectively, right? And you're doing okay, right? You're doing okay. I try to give them, I don't spend too much time on special grammars, what they call it in formal or in the classical method, right? So when we come out of the university system, we basically get what I'll call deconstruction, right? And so Derrida, the postmoderns, there is no truth. Contradictions don't matter. You can say one thing one day and another thing another day. And so not only do they not have the actual skills in terms of like how to navigate with phonics and alphabetics and understanding like there's a relationship between the words that come out of your mouth and reality, or at least there should be some objective relationship. On top of that, you get all this deconstructionist philosophy where there is no truth, right? And what therefore is left is subjective and what I feel, and what if I feel a certain way, then right, I just make my words fit with what I feel, not with what actually is real. But I spend a little bit of time distinguishing between general grammar and special grammar. So special grammar is language specific, and that means like, English has basically a Roman alphabet with a mixture of, French and German, right? And then it kind of gets turned into a pidgin language over time. And, different languages have different alphabetics. Some, in the East, they would have what do you call pictographs, right? Instead of, alphabetics, okay? I don't spend too much time on that, but I do spend time on general grammar. General grammar means that for any subject that you're going to study, there's basically key vocabulary that you have to understand. And basically, so if like even mathematics, has a general grammar, right? You got to know, right, what's the difference between addition, subtraction, multiplication. You have to know your integers, right, your fractions, okay, your operations. Once you know that general grammar, now you can actually figure it out on your own by applying the principle of non-contradiction. So I give them like a crash course in it. But at the end of the day, I mean, I'm kind of forced to do some of the whole language stuff myself. And I will say one more thing is that there is a certain truth to the whole idea. They say, oh, that, grammar doesn't, teaching skill and drill doesn't work. Now, there's a certain truth to that. And that is that, even anecdotally, I could say that I've tried it, like kind of snuck it in, and students can do very good on the worksheets, but they don't necessarily, it doesn't show up in their writing, because the language they use in their thinking head, right, when they're writing and they read it, it sounds okay because this is how they're used to talking and thinking, right? They think in this language. So just being able to diagram a sentence doesn't translate like that. And you say that the students, there's been this for years, right? The statistics are the same. If you're not, functionally literate or up to speed by 3rd or 4th grade, you're pretty much going to fall behind. And again, this goes back to basically doing whole language learning at the beginning. So, at the end of the day, there's not a whole lot, we can't undo it entirely. But I like to think that if I teach those principles and the student gets it and they're a thinker and they're somebody that, is just a critical thinker in general, that they can at least take those skills. Like, okay, wait, do I know all the key terms? Okay, did I put them in together in a way that makes sense? Did I contradict myself there, right? And then they can sort of navigate stuff on their own accordingly. But otherwise, I try to make my classroom not just like a crash course in the principles, but a place for exploring. Most of the stuff we read, I tell them right up front, like, I don't agree with. We're gonna read all kinds of stuff that you're not gonna agree with, and that's the point, And so you're gonna be in a crash course of like having to explain, defend your position on why you disagree with stuff. I'm sure in every other class, it's like, hey, all those buzzwords that you said you wanted to vomit out of your mouth, just regurgitate these after I regurgitate them to you, and then I will regurgitate a grade on your paper that you will like. So.
Yeah, and I guess, maybe we've moved off a little bit of the track of unions, but I think what I heard in your question, Jessica, was like, what do we do when the environment, or how do we have this environment that doesn't encourage this? Because clearly the ed tech world is going to take an existing environment that has made people narrow their thinking, but we're kind of already here. I guess that's what I kind of hear in that, and we're here structurally as educators, stuck in that. And even if we're in person, we're kind of in that situation. And we've conditioned students already prior to the kind of conditioning you just showed us, Jake, with that little, the thing that from the DreamWorks, that they want to make it even a narrower hole by which to, both assess people and direct people and direct their future in a particular way. That's kind of what I heard, which is, it feels like we're already in the trap that we're trying to avoid getting deeper into it. That's maybe what I've kind of heard in it.
Yeah, and I right. And another angle on that was, I remember she said something like, the amount of propaganda, in the advertising, like, you can go to the departmental meeting and you sound like you're watching a commercial, right? I mean, like, they're just like, it's not just the buzzwords that come down from the Department of Education that, like, everybody just tosses community-based this, equity that, right? Career pathways this. But then with all the vaccine stuff, it's like a Pfizer commercial and a Department of Ed commercial all rolled into one. So the kids are getting it from the TV, right? The department comes, you got all your cute little posters on the walls and stuff with all your cute graphics that regurgitate the same buzzwords. That's like I said, it's that. At the same way that you can't really undo all the lack of grammar. I don't know how you undo that. I mean, at the same time, There's always a few students, at least in any of the classes I've taught, where you could tell like that they get it. Like, and by get it, I mean, like when we read Brave New World is my best example, right? And I do that in English 102. There's always a few students that want to stick after class, and they understand this. I'm not just wanting to get through this basically 100-year-old novel and give me like I'm trying to like show them like where the world is going and basically how it's been going that way for a while. I think maybe I hate to say it like this because it sounds all kind of defeatist, but I think in some ways you just got to find those students. Like you're not. It's like the catcher in the rye. You can't save all of them. You're not gonna grab all of them. And it doesn't mean that you don't teach them is with the same amount of gusto and you provide the proper attention. But at the to think that that there's some lesson plan or some way to do it that's gonna grab everybody's attention. I don't think that's realistic. So.
Yeah, for me at least, maybe weirdly, there is some hope, that the people that do see the bullshit, basically, like kind of like the workers and students for choice thing that we got going here, people that are willing to like raise their heads up, right, and look around at the very least, even if we don't, have the same reasons or, for showing up to a space like that. And so for me personally, it's important to have this. To me is learning. Like having these discussions, not listening to a teacher going through a game, to be told, again, a scripted thing. And that, like you said, John, regurgitate back the information that I'm given. That is not learning. That is a prison to me and limiting. So I guess my point is just like Lipson, my hope is to grab those, or you, John, I think you said that to grab those kids, and those people, not just kids, because I do think we have to have an intergenerational conversation, in order to change this, right? And because I personally don't accept that, that everyone that's old doesn't get it. Like generational people get it, and I'm looking for the people that are willing to stand up and speak up and be loud. And I think that's all we can do. Continue to be loud to make those calls into the abyss to see if there is other pockets of resistance, and hopefully those kids that are rejected are the more human, independent ones that will fight back. Because I do think it's an uphill battle. Like you said, it's Jessica. It's concerning, right, when you see teachers themselves asking for this technology. Right. Yes, of course, the AFT sold out, right, to the Rockefellers, the Trilateralists, and the globalists and all this stuff. But teachers themselves have bought into this, and they've been conquered through fear, and logic is gone off the window, right? And so I don't know where I got this, but now we're practicing scientism, right? A religious practice of science, not actual science. We're regurgitating. We're doing all those things that we've been programmed to do. We're not critically thinking, and in doing so is a dangerous thing, right? Because we created the conditions, on the left, by and large, to reject those people that think differently, to reject the people that have questions, and to censor and punish it in many ways. So again, to me, it's like similar to you, John. I dropped out of college, 4.5 years into UC Berkeley. And, I was learning political economy, industrialized societies, philosophy, economics. I went in trying to learn economics. And then I realized this shit is limiting. The way they teach economics is limiting. It's like, oh, hold these variables. Those don't matter. We'll tend to that someday later. But those are real. It affects real people. And so by and large, I find more, solace in, or like refuge in people like my mother, who grew up learning about plants and indigenous languages in Guatemala. She was a teacher, actually. She was trained in that. And I was hands-on, with people and learning about nature and how that interacts. And so in that worldview, right, like a more indigenous worldview, and the people that are actually not formally educated, like I think we have to listen to them, because a lot of them have a sense. They may not have the exact words or the grammar or the syntax, to tell you, but like my mother and my brother, you know, they're not formally, like, they didn't go to UC Berkeley, but they held me accountable to my liberal bullshit during my liberal years. And then I go back and I'm like, you were fucking right the whole time. You know, my mother and my brother were right. You know, when I was trying to convince them to vote in a rigged system, they told me, fuck that shit. You know, sorry, we can edit that out. But my brother told me, like, fuck you. My brother right now, he doesn't care to discuss, you know, the details of the science of the vaccine and this, that. He doesn't want to get vaccinated, period. And he's like, I don't give a shit with your opinion or someone else's opinion. I just don't want it, you know, in period. I don't have to explain it to anyone else. It's my body. And so that's my point, like, you know, because in some ways our stuff here is kind of like limiting, right? Because of the language and the, you know, the concepts that we use. It's kind of, it segregates a sector of people, right? It's kind of, and so my point is that we got to listen to the wretched of the earth, as, you know, Frantz Fanon would say, you know, because they have a more like a gut feeling of what's going on. And maybe we can find something, you know, a way to fight back and organize, because the people that are more connected into the system, like the educators, you know, the technical people, you know, they're the ones doing the imperial work, trying to convince the others that they're wrong and they need to be educated.
Yeah. I mean, and, you know, I just did all I said. I threw out a bunch of jargon, all this, you know, trivia and grammar, but I think naturally, like, people are born with an intuition for, like, contradictions. Like, wait a minute, we just did this, but now we're doing that. Like, you know, without getting into all the terms, right? People know that, and especially if you're on the receiving end of, you know, oligarchy, right? I mean, your whole systemically, you can look around and see, like, man, why am I always working so hard? You know what I mean? All these other people, you know, are basically coasting by and they get all the profits, right? I mean, these things are intuitive, and I think that it's those students we talked about that that when, you know, like, there's those students that, you know, when I teach Brave New World, they kind of get it, and there's others that, you know, they're just trying to get the grade so they can get the job. I think that those other students that do that, I think a lot of those students operate on what you, like you said, fear and confusion, and then also a lack of self-esteem from being in that place of poverty often, right? Disenfranchised. You're the first person to ever go to college, right? And so you're already feeling like this isn't the place for me. I just, you know, these are authorities, and, you know, I need to get on the other end. So because they're operating at the emotional level and at the level of stress and confusion, they're largely going to go with what they see happening around them. So if we reach enough people to where the culture changes, and you know, the stuff on TV or whatever, I mean, the you know, the general discussions that they hear just in the osmosis of general social life, whether it be on TV or not, that's probably a bad example, right? That they'll go along with that, right? And I know that that's not the same as like waking people up or whatever, but you know, I think there'll always be people who are scared and confused, and they will always kind of just go with the crowd. So if you can get enough, you don't have to get the whole crowd, but if you can get enough people that are open to it, then the rest of the crowd kind of decides that that's what's cool, and not you know, all this horrific stuff that we're dealing with now.
Yeah, no, I appreciate the sort of hopeful expressions from you both. I guess I don't know, maybe I think I'm just tired today, but I am just feeling like, man, I mean, the tools that kind of enable me to reach those students, no matter how good of a teacher I might be or aspire to be, are just being taken away at such a pace. You know, I was frustrated before, you know, with the standardization and the grading system and the online learning systems and all of this, right? And now it's like the last year and a half, I mean, obviously shifting to Zoom just eliminates so much of the human connection that you have with those students, especially the ones that are struggling with poverty or tough family situations or mental health, right? And now, you know, all of the mandates and the political, you know, politicization of all of it, man, like, it just feels like there's so few opportunities, you know, and what I want to do is, like, kind of going back to what you said, Kenny, it's like, I mean, I teach a lot of like environmental rhetoric and environmental humanities class. It's like, I want to take my kids out into nature, right? And I used to do like community engaged classes. We'd have speakers like from the community who are not part of the institution, not part of, the ivory tower, like actually come into the classroom and have these discussions. And, that's just been like completely eliminated. And so it's just, man, like it's feeling really hard to reach those like already few students. And I just feel like I just feel like I'm losing them. And hopefully, right, like we're going back. And I don't know where we want to go with this conversation, but one thing I did want to ask Jake is like, there is some pressure from, I don't know, at least at my institution, like from on high, there's a lot of pressure to go back in person. We have like, I think 3.5 weeks until we go back. We start kind of late because we're on the quarter system, but already they're like preparing us, right? Like we have to go back in person. They've told us, like, at least in my department, like all English classes will be fully in person. But then we're also at the same time getting these dictates that have never been there before of like, but you also have to build your online module, like just in case, or if like a student gets COVID, they need to have access to participate in the class online. So you need to like set that up, or you might have to quarantine. And also the public health guidance might shift, right? So it's like basically they're requiring that we be ready at any second for any reason to shift back. And I'm curious kind of what you, all of you really think. We kind of know, right? Like the long-term goal is all remote ed tech monopoly, like 100%. But I'm curious kind of, the pressure to return to in person, both at K through 12 and university level, which to me seems like very likely to be sort of a short-lived return, but nevertheless, like, is the purpose of that basically to coerce medical surveillance and vaccine uptake in the short term to kind of like get that in place? Or is that an oversimplification? Is it just kind of because it's really hard to deny some of these like mental health, crises among young people and kids? It's very hard. I don't know. It's hard to justify like trying to think of it from the alternative perspective, but I don't know. What do you think about the sort of like, no, we're going back in person?
Yeah, they they asked if I was afraid to go back, like afraid of COVID. I'm afraid of that. I'm afraid of your contact tracing policies and your vaccine policies. So I was like, and they didn't have anything on writing. Like, I'm not going back to play, musical chairs between my house and this place, ad hoc and quarantine. You're not. You need a test. You don't. I was like, if you can, I asked them, like, and I just, politely said, if you can't give me a policy, you can give me an online class. And if you can't find me an online class, I'll be dragging trees for tree service this semester. And I basically got all online classes, and I am so happy because they just came out with the mandate. So if I didn't, they'd be telling me I gotta have one. And apparently, right now we don't have to have one unless we're on campus. I ain't on campus, so I don't have to deal with it. But I'll add this: that so while they were planning to go back, they were all talking about at the Technology Committee, well, we're going to set up simulcast in the classroom. So basically, if the student has to quarantine, they can watch it through. So even if there's like full in person, they're still going to be filmed. And like you said, they basically see before the lockdowns. I hate to say. I don't like Bill go into that whole narrative. It's really more lockdowns than it is, 99.9 anyway. But they, before we didn't have to have our LMSs. We do D2L at one school and we do Canvas at another. And I didn't have it, never did. I was, I'm old school, paper pen and all that. And now they're like, which didn't make it easy to transition, by the way. I had to build everything from scratch, anyways. But they said, now you got to have that on there in case we need to, whatever, go remote. So, okay, that makes sense. But then they're like you said, when we go back, we're going to film everything anyways. And so that's basically, you're going to be, your blended learning, right? So if we're going to film everything and we're going to potentially be going back, they're going to want you to mediate everything through the computer. And I haven't had it, but people are telling me, other people that are on campus, they're like, yeah, I overheard a conversation when I had to go up for a union meeting the other day, and they were like, what's going on with printing services? To print, like we used to be able, you could get it 24 hours in advance, right? Yeah, it might even be less than that. They're like, you got to do it a week in advance. Like, and if you're doing, if you're like, what if you want to try a new lesson, or, you're an adjunct and you're juggling 6 classes, not 3 like full-timers, sometimes you can't get to it, like a week in advance. I got 4 other classes, 5 other classes. So I don't know more about that, but it signals to me, that it's in line with that shift where even though we're here, we're really still mediating everything through digital means. So, that's my anecdotal response to that.
Yeah. I would agree. That I don't exactly know the whole game here in terms of, you go back but it does seem that the house is winning no matter what happens here. Right. So I'm back in person. I want to be back in person, but they're collecting my DNA. I've got to do PCR. Oh, you're not going to be vaccinated? You can do PCR. Oh, you're not going to be and for schools where there's a hard mandate, and this is happening in LA. I know, JP is facing this situation. He's found his exemption. Oh, you're going to go remote. So it's like, so you can't be in person with your students. Because I know that JP is not interested in the digital nightmare, and I know that Jake isn't interested in that, but that's the situation now you get. Oh, you don't want to be vaccinated? Now you go remote. Oh, you don't fight the vaccine? We'll come in and teach our kids, because I know you're going to be able to teach our kids conformity. I know you're going to be able to teach our kids that, listen, do as you're told, because that's what you're doing. And in the process, they already know that they can't do an all remote thing right now, but the Trojan horse is already inside the city. And so they can slowly, kind of etch away. And then any of us who are really a problem figure out how they move us out through some kind of either retiree or vaccine mandate or what have you. But the vaccines are not a small thing. I do think getting everyone to say, we all got to be back together, but to be together, we need to be safe. To be safe, we have to be vaccinated. That is not a small thing. So that in of itself is an accomplishment. So it does make me think like that we're not going to educate our students through our education system. And that's what Jake said early on. Like he said that everything, and this is true for me, really everything I've learned, I guess learning to read is important, but everything I've truly learned has been self-taught. And self-taught doesn't mean it was in conjunction with other people. And in my case, it's like Marxism and learning about history through that lens. But that was a self-education around other people who were trying to do that. And you can listen to like who is the head of the Black Panther Party way back in the Huey Newton. He talks about self-education through the criminal justice system that led him into the revolutionary politics and Maoism and things like that. That's how he became self-educated. And I think we have to understand that the education where we will receive education is through revolution. I mean, through the process of fighting this thing, of getting out of this system and dismantling that system. That is where the education is going to come from. So until we do that, until we build that network, we will lose, because I don't think there's any way of educating ourselves through their system towards something we're going to. And this is why the unions, they're part of the game, because they buy into the game. I do think, Jake, you've revealed just how deep, in your article, because I would have said that our unions in some ways are just doing what the members want. And there's some truth to that. But what I think what's in your article, Jake, is no, these folks at the top are connected deep to the top level oligarchs, the top level capitalists. They're in there with them, and they have a same plan in play. And it's not a good plan. It's a very bad plan. And it's not a question. Shanker doesn't think it's a bad plan because he has this vision of a world just staying as it is, and of workers being made into more efficient workers. And that's what we are as educators. So I like I do see in the beginnings of what's happening now, where the political associations I'm making are completely strange, very different than what has happened to me before. Of like, I just got off the phone with this guy from Napa who's like, he's a conservative. He goes, "Oh, I didn't vote for Trump." And I was like, "I got no problem if you voted for Trump, because you're against these mandates." And we had a great conversation. He was like, communism is just fascism. And I was like, I'm not sure I buy that, but we're going to work together. And there's going to be other folks like that. And I do see the beginning of a real firmness potentially to opposing the state, to opposing corporations, to opposing the system, and the attempt to destroy it. By feeling you're being destroyed by jabs, the willingness to destroy that system that is trying to destroy your body. And that to me is where the education will be, is can we build a network that can counter this other thing? But it won't happen through our schools. It's just, and I don't think it's going to happen through our unions, not through the teacher unions. I'll say that, because teachers, we're like mind cops, and we've just fallen for the whole thing. And our job is now to propagandize people to get on board. And that association, the teachers who are going to change this aren't going to do it through I don't think I'm going to go to class on Monday or today's Wednesday, on Thursday. There's nothing revolutionary except for the idea of association, to me, of like human to human contact, of connection, of trust built through that. That's it. That's the only thing that I believe in and what I'm doing there, is that trust in each other by seeing what's real with each other through your senses and through what feels. And you can't get that through a screen.
Yeah, I think that's the importance of what Kenny was saying too. I think I see you turn his mic off. He wants to jump in, but I just wanted to reaffirm what he had said last time, which was, listening to the people who don't have the formal education, whether they be old timers or not, but people that have like wisdom and experience living outside of a screen. Like, because I especially these last couple of years, and even towards doing the book, I've spent way more time, digitally than I ever wanted to, and there's people out there that know how to live outside of it. So you've got these people that are not formally educated or trained organizers, and you have to. That's part of that coalition that you're talking about, right? And then the other part is unions, like what Michael Caine is doing, which is being out of it, UFT, but bringing about 3,000 something people with them at that last rally. So it doesn't mean that the idea of unionizing as a concept goes away, but it's going to require coalitions with, like you said, all walks of life who believe in bodily autonomy, freedom of choice, and all that. And so yeah.
And a couple of things for me, Lipson, like to comment on your call with this quote conservative, right? Just a reminder to people that, at least from my view, my life experience with my family, like most of the people that are not getting vaccinated, the poor, the Black folk, the Latinx folk, they're all actually kind of conservative. If you really look at, a lot of the people from Latin America, they're conservative if there weren't, if their immigration wasn't that. That's a little reductive, right? We're not a monolith either. But in a lot of the resistance is happening in these poor communities. Most of the people are not getting vaccinated. People of color, conservative, poor conservatives, white conservatives, right? And so, maybe listen to them a little more. And it is uncomfortable. I went with my partner to a protest, that protest, Lipson, and we went in San Francisco, 200-300 people. And it was a little disorienting, to go there and having to see the American flag, right, being waved, because, the American flag is a warning sign. It's not a welcoming thing. But we're going to have to sit through that discomfort, and find that commonality. And also, I wanted to share a story, to those teachers that are hesitant, maybe. So I have a coworker. She has a second job. She used to work at a hotel in San Francisco. She was the building rep for their union. She was earning very good money, right? She was a cook. And during COVID, they got shut down, displaced. And they were being bought out, they're buying their contract out, and they want to close the place and reopen with a different type of, crew, I guess, paying less. The point is that she became a gig worker. She worked for Lyft and Uber. And she recently told me that she stopped doing that because she was robbed. And then multiple times her car broken in. So she was facing the liability of, being a worker for these tech companies like Lyft, Uber, blah, blah, blah. So she became a gig worker as a result of this displacement. And she was a building rep. She's very aware of, power and the owners and bosses versus, workers. And the point is that there's a story there, and she doesn't want to give up. She wants to keep pushing to get their job back, to get people together. They've been to protests during COVID. But that's, I think, the story that kind of reflects what's going to happen with teachers. They're going to drive you out of your building, and make you a gig worker. For those that are not being, conditioned and tracked from childhood, right? We're older, they don't want us so much as they want the young kids, but they're still going to profit from us, and they're still going to displace us, if we don't push back really hard in conjunction, and understanding that we're not just fighting a vaccine mandate. We're fighting capitalist forces, that are pretty big, and the fight is not easy, but it's going to take becoming, going into fight with solidarity with people like my coworker who's still fighting to get her job back. Even though she's doing a lot of other gig work in the meantime, she's still fighting to get back in that building, because she understands that that's the only way that that's where her safety is, right? Being together with other people. But it is a losing fight because she's struggling. But I think her story signifies what's happening, right? Because the only people that can fight back is people collectively. You can save your ass, try to fight a mandate, and get an exemption, but that's a temporary fix. That is just buying some time, maybe. But the real fight will be collective.
I think this conversation's kind of gone a little bit different than I thought, but I like it. So maybe Jessica and then maybe Jake, some final thoughts, and I'll just tell people to read your article.
And scroll down here to this thing here on pay for success and the community impact investments, data tracking, social credit for the fourth industrial revolution. So we basically talked a lot about public-private partnerships and the career pathways, and then how the adaptive learning software psychologically conditions the students to funnel them into these career pathways that go straight into these corporations. And those algorithms are designed to train them for those jobs. This is an infographic here from Alison McDowell. I think it's the title of it is "Pay for Success in the Human Value Chain." So you can obviously go to her Wrench in the Gears and check that out. This is I like this because this is a nice illustration of kind of when I showed you the Dreambox thing. That's kind of like the diagram for how it works on one student. This is sort of how it funnels the student through the career pathways financed by the Pay for Success impact grants, and how then it goes into the corporations. And so basically what that enables is, instead of the companies having to pay for in-house training, they can basically get it subsidized. Like the schools are going to pay for part of it, right? And then the federal and the state government will thereby, right, if it's a public school, pay for part of it. But one of the things with the Pay for Success grants, which is a form of impact investing, is that if the student doesn't get the outcome, right, the outcomes-based education, which is related to the competency-based, if they don't reach the agreed-upon level of competency through the agreed-upon workforce outcome, that company gets its money back, right? So this is a way for it to basically not just make sure it can use the public schools to subsidize their in-house training and funnel them straight into their company, but also where they don't have to waste a penny even on that, because if the student doesn't perform, then they're not gonna they don't have to, they get that money back. Okay. And then, I wanted to point out that all of our friends that we pointed out, Trilateral Commission, Rockefeller Foundation, UNESCO, and IBM, these people, all these companies are invested in impact finance. Okay, this little diagram here is from the Rockefeller Foundation Impact Investment Management Council. You'll see there it says ESG, that's environmental, social, and governance. So when they give the impact investments, it can be for like to improve poverty, and so that's one of your workforce pathways. But they can also give impact investments for like sustainability goals. Okay, and then they do other stuff like gender equity and racial equity and things like that. So when they talk about environment, if you ever see that acronym ESG, that is basically a little buzzword that basically relates to the impact financing. Okay, and then you'll see here that one of the main places that the schools can funnel the impact investment through is through what they call community schools, right? And so I've written several articles on community schools. I've got one that community schools are not the antidote to charter schools, because that's basically how they've been being pushed, right? So charter schools, as we mentioned, is like the corporatization of the public schools, public-private partnerships, right? But community schools, although they can have a public, an elected board, which a charter school does not, what they have to have, if it's going to be a full-service community school, they have to have these things called wraparound services. And wraparound services are public-private partnerships. And there's wraparound services is basically everything from healthcare. So that could be, your physical health to your mental health. And it's also crime prevention for at-risk students. And then there's also the workforce training components. And then there has to be a data tracking component to it. So in other words, these wraparound services, or otherwise they call them pipeline services, you're going to track the outcomes, the student outcomes for the health, the crime prevention, and the workforce based on the data. The data is basically going to come through all their digital devices, and then based on those outcomes data, that's what's going to determine whether or not the company gets its money back, or whether or not maybe you get another impact loan. And the AFT is really pushing community schools, and in particular, they actually are saying they're especially needed for COVID or a post-COVID society, because one of the things that they can do is through some of the social programs is like they might, the community schools might be able to loan out laptops or things like this. But then obviously they're going to give you the healthcare services. You might need COVID testing, need some PPE, and then also in addition to that, there is the Cardona, Secretary Cardona right now is pushing these pop-up clinics, right? To get your vaccines at all these pop-up clinics at the school. Well, that's a wraparound service, right? And so you'll also see, if I scroll down a little bit more, that several other companies, there was the AFT is part of the Coalition for Community Schools, okay? And they gave out some awards. And some of these awards were for various schools, various different community schools that I guess had some very effective community partnership programs. And some of these community wraparound services were financed by Goldman Sachs, and then also the Pritzker Foundation, right? And that's my government, right? So, and then you'll also see that the CDC itself. So this is a CDC document on impact investment, and you'll also see that they promote community health school programs. Okay, so the CDC itself is promoting impact investing for community school programs. So if people thought that I was loosely affiliating the lobbying of the AFT to get the CDC to essentially create a situation where they have to have more data mining through distance learning or hybrid learning, CDC has an incentive there as well. And I should mention that one of the people that was on the there she is. It was in the emails, the CDC AFT email exchanges where they were doing that lobbying. Her name is Marla, I believe it's pronounced Uccelli Kasia, and she is assistant to the president for educational issues at the AFT. She's the former associate director of working communities at the Rockefeller Foundation. Okay. And so I showed you that Rockefeller Philanthropies has got its own impact investment firm. And then you also have IBM, and we said that IBM was at the Trilateral Commission meeting with AFT. They're into impact investment with the United Nations through this NGO or this impact investment organization called Impact Leadership 21. So you've got the United Nations Economic and Social Council, and then also a foundation for the support of the United Nations. And then we can also find in here, so there's the other part of the Rockefeller Foundation's impact investment. But you also see that Dinah Habib Powell, who is now Dinah Powell McCormick, she was Assistant Secretary of State for Educational and Cultural Affairs under George W. Bush. She was also a national security advisor to Donald Trump and senior counselor for economic initiatives to Donald Trump. And she was also the head of impact investing at Goldman Sachs. And there was an article that she did in the American Enterprise Institute where she's promoting impact investment, and the Trilateral Commission posts that article on their website. So everybody that I mentioned that Shanker was hanging out with, in the 80s, Rockefellers, Trilateralists, and then all these other corporate globalists, they all are into impact investing. So is the AFT. So is the CDC. Okay, so they're all, it's a big club, and you ain't in it as teachers ain't in it, as George Carlin told them. So I just wanted to wrap up with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's again a lot. I mean, all I would say is that kind of gives me I think you had, in the article, it was sort of like as if the AFT was making the CDC do something, but it's like all these institutions at the top are all pointing the finger at somebody else who's kind of like direct. Oh my God, Gizmo, stop. Are all pointing the finger at somebody else while they all collaborate and collude to do it, saying that, well, it was them that got me to kind of do it. We did it reluctantly, and yet it's like each tentacle is connected to that same octopus.
Yeah, I mean, at the very least, they are all doing the same things. They're all on the same page. And, you could say that, Dinah Habib Powell doesn't interact with Marla Uccelli-Kashyap, and, Shanker was third, but it's all the same agenda, and all the institutions are on the same page together. So, at the very least, I mean, and I'm not purporting that they all get in a smoke-filled room and like, ha, 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 but I mean, they all have the same financial monetary incentive, and they're all pitching the same slogans at the same time. So and they all convert together, like I just said. Kashyap was, she worked for Rockefeller. There's kind of that's the other part, that there's kind of a revolving door between a lot of these institutions as well.
Just real quick, to what John said about that revolving door. Sounds like, again, the CDC, right? The pharmaceuticals. Sounds like the weapons manufacturing and the military. It sounds, and again, it's just, I mean, can it be any more obvious?
I would say, right? I mean, right? I mean, another way to say that is, look, if you look at all those connections and you're like, and then think there's nothing there, like there's nothing to see here, that's just all a coincidence. All of them. Like maybe if it was just IBM and the AFT, or maybe if it was just, Rockefeller, it's all of them. It's literally all of them. And it's for 40 years. So, I mean, if you can't think that there is something there that needs to be untangled or otherwise resolved or addressed, I think you're one of those people that you're one of those students that we're gonna hope gets it later when we focus on other people that had years to hear.
And just one more thing, John, you mentioned this in a previous episode where, again, you just mentioned 40 years. It hasn't It's been continuity. It's not like that binary of the Democrat, Republican. It's irrelevant. There's been a consistent project to get us to this point.
Yeah. I mean, here's another example. So Zbigniew Brzezinski, and I've got a picture of the book, Between Two Ages, America's Role in the Technocratic Era. It's 1970. So not too long before he set up the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller. In that book, he's got a segment in there where he talks about the future of education. And in particular, he's talking about how what he calls television consoles and other electronic devices will be modified to transmit education in the home. And then he also says that businesses will play a big part in the future of education through what he says, quote, scientific management. Right. And so, again, I mean, that's just another example. I mean, what do we have now? I mean, that's basically your Zoom, your adaptive learning software is the scientific management, the business is your public-private partnerships. Right. And, it's been a consistent move forward, the whole time. So,
yeah. And I mean, just coming back to like Kenny's framing at the beginning of capitalism. I mean, for me, like I was just come back to at the heart of this, right? It's like commodification of students, of like these human beings that, I mean, as teachers, that's like what we're there for. I mean, most of us go into this because we love our students, certainly not for the paycheck. It's just so frustrating to see the teachers continue to kind of, prop up the system at every level, like whether it's the unions, whether it's like programmatic, whether it's higher up, the echelons. And I think, like we've been saying, it's just going to take a much broader coalition than just like, me marching into my department meeting and trying to get people to listen because they're not.
Yeah, and I really think that it does have to happen outside of those institutional channels, because another example that I wanted to mention earlier, I kind of almost went on a tangent with it, was when I was talking about Anna Herzer, my friend Anna Herzer. And she was one of her, Kenneth Goodman, Janet Beach. I think there was another one that was sort of at the forefront of this, but they filed a resolution with the Arizona Federation of Teachers to ban the Skinner method through equity, mastery learning, and a bunch of other Pavlovian programs, direct instruction. There's all sorts of buzzwords from the 80s it was all Skinner method, and I've got all sorts of documents to show that that's what those euphemisms really mean, and I'll be putting them in my database eventually. But so they passed that Arizona resolution, and they brought it to the national. So we're getting back to this discussion about how the federation is organized from the local to the state to the national. When they brought it to the national, it was tabled by the National Executive Committee. And I asked her, so what exactly does that mean? Like I asked, did they preempt it for a vote? Did they vote it down? How did that work? She said it was tabled. So the best way that I understand it is when the state passes a resolution, they can bring it to the national. But then there's this National Executive Council or committee that it's probably like 10 people, or it's not a huge. It's not like 50 people, one from every state, right? It's just the national branch, and it's pretty small. And she said that somebody tabled it. We don't know who, but Shanker is on that, would have been on that committee, right? And so it never actually even went to vote it was supposed to, had it got passed at the National Executive Council, it would have went to vote at that year's national conference. I want to say it was 83, and it never did. So this is just another example of, even then, and it probably was a lot easier back then. I mean, probably, I basically guarantee it was, right? Because we weren't locked in a digital screen prison, and, there wasn't the rank propaganda where, people who identify as left somehow think that Microsoft and Google are helping us right now. So, it just ultimately has to happen at that grassroots level, making, like Andy said, these really strange coalitions. But that to me, that's just a beautiful thing. And like, I mean, you know, we did our meeting a couple weeks ago, and I genuinely got choked up just to see all the, you know, just the different, just, you know, people that we're supposed to, you know, if we were to follow the propaganda, we're supposed to all hate each other and fight, and we're not. And so, you know, they cannot destroy that. And as long as that persists, like we're going to have the upper hand in the long run. We just got to have the endurance to weather the storm, right? And so, you know, we got to let them punch themselves out and let that propaganda lose its effectiveness while we build some relationships.
Well, that actually sounds like some good words to wrap up on then. Well done, Jake. It was getting pretty depressing.
I've learned that ever since my publisher said, you can't just end it on all these evil, negative. You got to give solutions. I've learned that anytime I have some sort of public speaking opportunity, I got to end on some sort of uplifting thing. Right?
Well, just particularly these figures with all these wheels in them, man. I feel like I'm caught in a prison.
What do you mean, those pictures that I was showing?
Yeah, like
Yeah.
go around.
Little hamster wheel. We're the hamsters.
Yeah, you got it.
All right.
Hamster wheel.
So I'm going to do Eduardo's wrap up here. And all right, so that does it for this week's episode. What's Left is a weekly political podcast channel challenging the mainstream left. We post information about our topics and our guests on the episode notes wherever you found this episode or on our blog, what-s-left.webnode.com. You can find past episodes to this podcast channel there and connect with us. We're on Spotify. These podcasts are Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, and the channels where you can see the video are BitChute, Odyssey, YouTube, and we're also on Telegram. If you would like to give us feedback about something you've heard or suggest something for us to cover, contact us through our blog. So I'm Andy Lipson with Kenny Zepeda and guest anchor Jessica. Thank you very much, Jessica, for being here. And of course, Jake, thanks again for being a guest and sharing this information with us and being part of a kind of a discussion I didn't expect. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, man, it's always an honor to be here. Thanks so much, and thanks to Kenny and Jessica as well.
All right, so we'll see y'all next week.